Where am I? What happened? We have to go now. I'm scared. Stay with me. Look at me. It's coming down. Almost there. Go. Rochelle Bennett had steady hands. 10 years in the ER had made sure of that. But when she peeled back the bandage from the man's shoulder and saw what lay underneath the fresh wound, her hands stopped moving. A scar. Crescent-shaped, raised and pale against dark skin, the kind of mark only fire leaves behind. She had seen that scar before. Not in a file. Not in a photograph. In the broken half-memory of a smoke-filled hallway when a pair of arms had lifted her off a floor she could not feel anymore and carried her out of a burning building on Marlowe Street. 5 years ago. She had never seen his face. "Did you pull someone out of the Marlowe Street fire?" she asked, her voice barely holding. 5 years ago. Lorenzo Bishop yanked his sleeve down, asked for a different nurse, and turned toward the wall. If this story already has you, go ahead and hit subscribe. There are more like it every week. Now let's go back to the beginning. Lorenzo Bishop did not talk about the fire. Not to his foreman, not to his daughter's teacher when she called to say Ivy had written an essay about it in class. Not to the grief counselor the hospital assigned him 5 years ago, whose office he visited exactly once before deciding that talking about Danica was not going to bring her back. He was 38, a licensed electrician with 16 years of clean work behind him, and a father who packed school lunches at 6 in the morning and helped with math homework he barely remembered how to do himself. That was the life he had built after Marlowe Street. Quiet, functional, held together by routine and by the understanding that some things were better left sealed shut. His daughter Ivy was 11 and already too perceptive for anyone's comfort. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's habit of watching people a beat longer than was polite. She knew her father went silent whenever anyone mentioned the fire, and she had learned not to ask. What she believed, what Lorenzo had allowed her to believe, was that her father had done everything he could to save her mother. That was true enough. It had to be true enough. What he had never told her was the rest of it, that he had carried another woman out first, that by the time he went back inside the staircase had already come down, that every night for 5 years in the 10 minutes between the light going off and sleep arriving, he did the arithmetic of that decision again, and it always came out the same way. He had spent the only minutes that mattered on a stranger, and Danica had died alone in the smoke. He didn't know who the woman was. He had never looked at her face. He had set her down on the sidewalk, made sure she was breathing, and gone back in. That was the whole of it. A body he had moved from one place to another, and a bill he had been paying ever since. Rochelle Bennett was 34 and had not slept a full night since that same fire, though she would not have said so to anyone at work. She was good at her job, precise, calm under pressure, the kind of nurse the residents learned to follow when a shift went sideways. She had built that reputation on purpose, one shift at a time, because competence was the one thing she could control. Everything else had felt breakable since Marlowe Street. The panic came without warning. A patient's coat left too near a heating vent, smoke off a food truck on her walk in from the parking garage. Small things that stopped her mid-step and sent her pulse into a register she associated with waking up on a sidewalk she did not remember reaching, surrounded by paramedics with no memory of how the fire started or how she got out. She remembered a voice, low, steady, cutting through the noise. "Look at me. Breathe with me. Don't go to sleep." She remembered being carried. She did not remember a face. For 5 years she had looked. She went back to the Marlowe Street block every year on the anniversary. She filed requests with the fire department for the names of civilians who assisted in the evacuation. She got nowhere. Whatever records existed were incomplete, sealed, or simply missing. She told herself she only wanted to say thank you. That was all. She was not a sentimental woman. She just needed to close the loop. Neither of them knew that the fire that took Danica Bishop and broke 2 other lives had not been an accident. And neither of them knew that the man responsible had his name engraved on the bronze donor plaque outside the hospital's new emergency wing. Gavin Sloan had built his real estate portfolio the way a certain kind of man builds one. He cut costs in the places that were hard to inspect and bet that nothing would go wrong. When something did go wrong on Marlowe Street, he moved fast, bought out the building, settled with the families who made noise, made sure the investigation ran out of fuel before it found anything with his name on it. He was good at that. He had been doing it for 20 years. He was not done. The call came in at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning. Male 38 construction site injury, possible shoulder fracture, lacerations from a falling beam. Rochelle took the intake without looking up from the chart she was updating. By the time she reached Bay 4, the paramedics had him on the gurney and he was sitting upright, jaw set, refusing the pain medication they kept offering. "I need to be out of here by noon," he said. "You're not going to be out of here by noon." She pulled on gloves. "Can you tell me where the pain is?" "Shoulder. It's fine." "It's not fine." Blood was already through the temporary dressing. "I need to look at it." He didn't argue again. He turned slightly on the gurney and let her work, staring at the wall with the flat concentration of a man managing pain by refusing to acknowledge it. In the seconds before she lifted the dressing, she heard him breathe out shallow and heard words come with it so quiet they were barely words at all. "Look at me. Breathe with me. Don't go to sleep." Rochelle's hands paused above the bandage. He was not speaking to her. He was not fully aware he had spoken. It was the kind of phrase a person repeats so many times it stops being language and turns into reflex. She knew that phrase. She had heard it in a hallway full of smoke 5 years ago. She lifted the dressing. The wound was clean but deep. The beam had torn through the outer layer of muscle. She started the assessment mechanically, hands moving through the steps while the rest of her caught up to what she had just heard. Then she saw it. Below the fresh laceration at the curve of his shoulder was a burn scar. Old, fully healed, crescent-shaped, the shape a scar takes when fire catches fabric and holds for a moment before somebody beats it out. Rochelle's hands stopped. She stood there for a stretch of time she could not account for afterward. Then, from somewhere she had not planned, she heard her own voice. "Did you pull someone out of the Marlow Street fire 5 years ago?" The change was immediate. Every muscle in him shifted. He reached up with his good arm and dragged the gown back over the shoulder, and his face, which had been carefully neutral, closed all the way down. "I need a different nurse." "Sir, please. I need a different nurse." It was quiet, and underneath the quiet was something that had nothing to do with her. She stepped back. She found her supervisor. She went to the break room and stood at the sink for 5 minutes with cold water running over her wrists. After her shift, she pulled the post-fire admission records from the night of Marlow Street. It took her 40 minutes to find the entry. Lorenzo Bishop, 33 at the time, presenting with minor burns to the right hand and forearm, treated and released. Then she found the section of the report that covered evacuation assistance, where civilians who helped get residents out were documented for the record. His name was gone. Not absent, because nobody added it. Gone. There was a gap where a name had been and a line of formatting that didn't match the entries above it. That kind of gap did not happen by accident. Somebody had taken him out of the record. She sat with that a long time. The next morning she learned what had happened after he left the ER. His employer, a construction firm working under contract to the Sloan Group, had declared the injury the result of his own failure to follow safety protocol. He had been terminated. His workers' compensation claim had been denied pending investigation. The hospital bill with no insurance behind it was going to be considerable, and the man who had, she was now nearly certain, carried her out of a burning building 5 years ago was going home to an 11-year-old daughter with no job, no coverage, and a shoulder that needed physical therapy he could not pay for. She went back to Bay 4 and looked at the empty gurney. Then she picked up her bag and went to find his address. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that was clean but tired, the kind of place kept up for a long time by people with no margin for error. He opened the door in a gray t-shirt, arm in a sling, and looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite anything else. "You can't be here." "I'm not here as your nurse," Rochelle said. "I'm here because your name was deleted out of the Marlow Street evacuation report, and I think you already know why." A beat. He opened the door wider. The apartment told her things before he said a word. A child's drawings taped to the refrigerator, a framed photograph on the windowsill of a woman caught mid-laugh turning toward the camera, a stack of paper on the kitchen table that resolved when she looked closer into overdue bills and a lease renewal notice. Lorenzo sat down without offering her a chair. She took one anyway. "Before the accident," she said, "you were photographing the electrical wiring at the site." He looked at her. "Your foreman put it in the incident report. He said you'd been documenting things. He said you told him you were going to send it to the building inspector." Silence. The wiring brand in those photos is the same brand that was installed in the Marlowe Street building. I pulled the permit file. Same supplier, same year. Something moved across his face, not surprise. He had already made that connection himself. It was the other thing. The thing that happens when a suspicion you have carried alone finally gets said out loud by somebody else. I don't want to talk about Marlowe Street. I know. My daughter thinks I did everything I could. You did. You don't know that. His voice was flat. You don't know what I did or didn't do. Rochelle looked at the photograph on the windowsill, then back at him. I know you carried somebody out, she said. I know you went back in. I know the staircase came down. She paused. I know because I'm the person you carried out. The kitchen went very quiet. Lorenzo looked at her for a long time without speaking. His expression did not break open the way she half expected. It did the opposite. It went still and careful, and she understood that whatever he felt about this was something he had spent 5 years learning to keep below the waterline. I want to help you, she said. I want to find out what actually happened, not only for you. Because I think if we find out what happened on Marlowe Street, we find out why your accident wasn't an accident. And if we do that, he said, everything about that night comes out. Yes. He was quiet a while. From the other room came the sound of a television, some children's program, something with a theme song. Ivy doesn't find out, he said finally. Not until we know all of it. Agreed. He looked at her once more, then away out the window at something she could not see. All right, he said. The sealed records were the first wall. Rochelle started with the hospital's own archive, post-fire admissions from the night of the fire triage logs, attending notes. She found what she expected, her own record incomplete because she had arrived unconscious. 3 other residents treated for smoke inhalation, 2 firefighters with minor burns. What she did not find was any documentation of how the building had been emptied, which residents had been assisted, or who had helped get them out. Those files were sealed. The notation read, restricted at request of property management pending civil litigation settlement. The settlement had been finalized 4 years ago. The restriction had never been lifted. She took it to her supervisor. Her supervisor took it to the hospital administrator. 2 days later, Rochelle was called into an office she had never been summoned to before and told in the careful language institutions use to protect themselves that Gavin Sloan's foundation had committed $8 million to the construction of the new emergency wing, that the hospital was not positioned to create friction in that relationship, and that she might consider whether the records she was looking for fell within the scope of her professional responsibilities. She left the office, walked down to the parking garage, and sat in her car for a while. Lorenzo was running into walls of a different shape. He sent his resume to 11 companies in the first week. 3 called back. 2 of those calls ended the same way, politely and fast, once his previous employer came up. The third went further, scheduled an interview, then canceled it the morning it was supposed to happen, and gave no reason. The Sloan Group had put him on what the industry called a safety concern list, a document that circulated informally among contractors and project managers across the city. It was not legal technically. It was also close to impossible to prove. His name was on it, and until somebody was willing to go on record about how the thing worked, there was nothing he could do about it. He was 3 weeks from missing rent. Around the same time, he noticed his phone was gone. He had last seen it at the hospital during his initial treatment, set down on the tray table while the nurses worked on his shoulder. When he asked, the ER staff had no record of it. He filed a report and let it sit. He assumed it had been misplaced. He did not yet understand what losing it would cost him. He told Rochelle about the phone and the job situation on a Wednesday evening, standing at his kitchen counter while Ivy did homework at the table, keeping his voice low enough that she could not hear. I had savings. Enough for a couple of months after that. He stopped. I want to cover the hospital bill, Rochelle said. No. Lorenzo. No. His voice was patient and absolute. You don't owe me a life because I pulled you out of a building once. She was quiet a moment. Then you can't spend the rest of yours sentencing yourself for something that wasn't your fault. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not agreement. Not quite. The first sign that the words had landed somewhere they couldn't be brushed off. He didn't answer. He also didn't walk away. In the weeks that followed, the distance between them changed the way distances change when two people stop performing normalcy at each other and start simply occupying the same rooms. Rochelle came by in the evenings, not always for a reason. Ivy, who had first regarded her with the watchful reserve of a child who had learned not to trust new arrivals, softened by degrees. First tolerating her, then aiming the occasional remark at her. Then one evening asking her to look over a science project without being asked to ask. Lorenzo watched all of it from across the room and said nothing. But he watched. Otis Rayner lived in a house that smelled like old paper and coffee, with filing boxes stacked in every room and a golden retriever who had apparently decided Rochelle was the most interesting thing to happen all year. He was 71, 6 years retired, with the eyes of a man who had seen enough things go wrong to know when they had not gone wrong on their own. "Marlowe Street," he said once they were at his kitchen table. "I've been waiting 6 years for somebody to come ask me about Marlowe Street." He had been the lead fire investigator on the case. He had been the one to write down what the crews found when the building was finally safe to enter. A fire exit on the 3rd floor secured with a chain and a padlock, not an old padlock rusted shut. A new one, the kind you buy at a hardware store for $11. The chain had been put there by the building's maintenance supervisor under instruction from the property management company. The instruction was documented in an internal email that Otis had obtained during the investigation. The property management company reported to the Sloan Group. "The exit was locked," Lorenzo said. "The exit was locked," Otis said. "If it had been open, the staircase wouldn't have been the only way down. People would have walked out of that building." He paused. "Your wife would have had another way out." Lorenzo looked at the table. "I tried to get it to trial," Otis said. "I had the email. I had photographs of the padlock housing still bolted to the door frame. I had a chain of custody that ran straight up to Sloan's management team." He shook his head. "Before I could file anything formal, his lawyers were already talking to the families, settlement offers, non-disclosure clauses. One by one, the people I needed as complainants signed and went quiet. Without them, my evidence was circumstantial. The investigation closed." "Where are the photographs now?" Rochelle asked. "Storage unit off Kessler. Everything's out there. 30 years of files." He gave her a look she didn't know how to read yet. "Most of it, anyway. I'm careful about the parts that matter." She asked about the emergency call recordings. Otis stood, went to a filing box in the hallway, and came back with a small digital recorder. He set it on the table and pressed play. The recording was from the night of the fire. The call had come from inside the building. For the first few seconds, there was only noise alarms shouting somewhere behind it, and then a woman's voice, clear and deliberate, like someone who had made a decision and wanted it said out loud. "Lorenzo, listen to me. There's a woman on the 3rd floor landing. She's unconscious. She's right by the stairs. Get her out first." A man's voice. Lorenzo's younger, torn open with fear. "Danica, where are you? Just tell me where. I'm okay. I have time to find another way. Get her out first. Go." The recording ended. The kitchen was absolutely quiet. Rochelle understood what she had just heard, understood it all at once, and the weight of it settled onto her chest like something with mass. Lorenzo had not chosen to save a stranger instead of his wife. Danica had told him to. She had known about the locked exit or suspected it, and she had sent her husband toward the only working way out with another person in his arms, because she believed she would find her own route. She had been wrong about the last part. But the decision had been hers. Lorenzo sat with his hands flat on the table. His face was not readable in any ordinary way. It was the face of a man experiencing something too large to fit into an expression. Not grief exactly, because grief was something he had been living inside for 5 years. Something else. The rearrangement of a story he had told himself so many times it had become the foundation under everything else. He stood up without a word, walked out into Otis's hallway and stopped there facing the wall. Rochelle did not follow. She let him stand. She looked at Otis. Otis looked at the recorder. Neither of them spoke. After a while from the hallway there was the sound of one controlled breath going out, then silence. Then Lorenzo came back and sat down. "What else do you have?" he said. They didn't hear Ivy come in. She had been waiting in the car and she had come inside because the battery on her phone was dead and she wanted to know how much longer they would be. She stopped in the hallway when she heard voices, and being 11 and curious, and not yet trained in the ethics of listening at doors, she listened. She did not hear the beginning. She did not hear her mother's voice on the recording or Otis explaining the padlock. She heard the end, a fragment of Rochelle's voice as she worked back through the sequence out loud. He carried her out. Before your mother. 6 words reaching Ivy with every piece of context stripped off them. She came into the kitchen and looked at Rochelle. He carried you out first. Her voice was very level for someone whose hands were shaking. You're why he didn't get back in time. Ivy, Lorenzo stood. You're why she died. Not a question. A verdict. The voice of a child who had spent 5 years building a story around a hole in her life and had just found the piece that finished it in the worst possible shape. That's not what happened, Rochelle said carefully. If you listen to the recording, I don't want to hear a recording. Ivy was already backing toward the door. I want you to not be here. I want you to stop coming to our house. She looked at her father. Tell her. Lorenzo reached for her. Baby, listen to me. Tell her to stop coming. She walked out. The front door opened and closed. Lorenzo stood in the middle of Otis's kitchen with 5 years of small protective compromises landing on him all at once. Every decision to keep Ivy away from the whole story, every choice to let her keep the simpler version, and he understood exactly and far too late what those choices had cost. He looked at Rochelle. Give me time. I need to talk to her. Not tonight. When I know how. I know. She picked up her bag. At the door, she paused without turning around. Take the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. She drove home and sat in her apartment a long while without turning on the lights. Gavin Sloan did not wait. Within a week of the visit to Otis, pressure arrived on 2 fronts at once, which told Rochelle that somebody had been watching the house. At the hospital, she was called in and informed that accessing restricted records without administrative authorization was a violation of privacy protocol. She was suspended pending a formal review. Her supervisor would not meet her eyes through any of it. The hospital's legal team had clearly already spoken to Sloan's people. You could hear it in the language, careful and pre-negotiated. That same week, Lorenzo received a certified letter from the Sloan Group's legal division, notifying him that he was being sued for theft of proprietary documents. The photographs of the wiring. The suit was almost certainly unwinnable for them. The photos were on a personal device and documented a safety hazard. But the process itself would cost money and time and put his name in civil court records, which would make work even harder to find. That was the point. Then Danny Walsh, the site foreman, who had agreed to confirm the substandard wiring a man Lorenzo had worked beside for 3 years, withdrew his statement. No explanation. Lorenzo called him twice and got nothing. And the phone, the one Lorenzo had assumed was simply lost, was clearly not lost. It had been taken during his ER visit before he understood what it was worth. Every photograph of that wiring, every piece of documentation he had built over weeks of quiet observation was gone with it. He told Rochelle all of it standing at his kitchen window. Ivy was at her Aunt Carol's for the weekend, and the apartment felt different without her in it, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with noise. They're moving fast, Rochelle said, because we got close. He turned from the window. The minute we walked into Otis's house, somebody knew. Rochelle had her own warnings by then. 2 colleagues told her separately that they had heard the licensing board had been contacted about her record access. If a formal complaint got filed, the suspension could become permanent. She had spent 11 years building a career inside that building. She sat with that fact and arrived every time at the same place. Lorenzo had gone back into a burning building for a stranger. She was not going to protect her professional reputation by letting the man who gave him that scar walk away clean. She also recognized that her presence in his life was making things harder for Ivy. The girl had not spoken to her since Otis's house, and Lorenzo was caught between 2 things he did not know how to hold at once. She told him one evening without making it larger than it was. When this is done, I'll step back, give you and Ivy room to work through it without me in the middle. He looked at her. That's not what I want, he said, and then stopped as if the words had gotten out before he approved them. The silence after that was specific rather than empty, full of something neither of them had room to name. We finish this first, Rochelle said. Yeah, he said. We finish this first. The call came at 2:17 in the morning. Otis's storage unit, the one off Kessler where he kept the physical copies of the investigation. The photographs, the chain of custody documents was burning. Lorenzo was out of the apartment before he had fully processed why moving on the same instinct that had moved him 5 years ago. Otis kept late hours. Otis was sometimes out there past midnight going through boxes. The unit was 15 minutes away. Rochelle got the alert from Otis's neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Martha who had her number from an earlier visit. She drove fast. She smelled it before she saw it. The smoke reached her through the car vents a block out. By the time she pulled into the lot, the unit was fully involved, orange light moving behind the rolling door, a column of black smoke climbing into the dark, 2 engines already on scene, a small crowd at the edge of the asphalt. She stepped out of the car. The smell hit her fully then, and her body did what it had been doing for 5 years. Chest locking down, breath going shallow, the world narrowing to a bright, airless point. She stood in the open car door and could not make herself move forward. She knew it was irrational. She knew the distance was safe. She knew her legs were not going to carry her. She stood there gripping the top of the door, watching the fire, while inside her chest an argument 5 years old played itself out in real time. Across the lot, Lorenzo had already gone in. He found Otis where he was afraid he would, trying to drag a box of files toward the door with the smoke already in him. Lorenzo got him out. He had the old man through the entrance and onto the sidewalk when the interior supports let go behind him and a steel roof beam came down across his shoulder. The same shoulder. He did not go down. He kept moving until Otis was clear of the building. Then he went down. Rochelle, from where she stood, saw him drop at the edge of the light. She let go of the car door. She crossed the lot. She did not think about it. Her legs moved, and she went with them through the smoke and the noise and the particular quality of heat she associated with the worst night of her life. She reached him and got her hands on him and started the assessment the way she would in any bay, in any ER. Airway, breathing, circulation. Except she was kneeling on asphalt at 2 a.m. with engines running behind her and smoke filling her lungs, and she did not stop and she did not freeze. She stayed with him until the paramedics arrived, and then she stayed with them. She was still with him when the police arrived. A patrol officer found a gas can beside the rear tire of Lorenzo's truck. It had not been there when he parked. Rochelle knew that, because she had stood 3 feet from that bumper earlier in the evening while they talked, and there had been nothing on the ground. But it was there now, and it looked a specific way to officers arriving at the scene of a fire. Lorenzo went into the ambulance with his wrist cuffed to the rail. The storage unit was gone. Otis was unconscious and on his way to the same hospital. The photographs, the chain of custody documents, 30 years of a man's work reduced to wet ash. Before the ambulance doors closed, Lorenzo looked at her. He looked at her the way a man looks when he has decided that what he says next is the last thing he intends to say for a while. "Walk away," he said. "You don't owe me this. You never owed me anything." The doors closed. Rochelle stood in the lot while the crews worked methodically through what was left. She thought about Ivy, who would wake up at Carol's house to the news that her father had been arrested. She pulled out her phone and called Carol so the girl would hear it from family before she saw it anywhere else. Then she called the only lawyer she trusted. The suspension letter arrived on a Friday. Rochelle read it at her kitchen table, set it down and made coffee. She had a hearing in 10 days. If the licensing board found for the complaint which Sloane's legal team had filed quietly through a third party, she would lose her nursing license. 11 years. The career she had rebuilt from nothing after Marlowe Street when she needed something to hold on to and had chosen this. Her colleagues were kind the way people are kind when they are relieved it is not happening to them. 2 of them called to tell her she should settle, accept whatever Sloane's people offered, sign the agreement, move on. She understood the logic. She also understood what moving on would mean. Lorenzo would face an arson charge alone with no medical testimony to challenge the prosecution's theory of the case. Otis was still unconscious. The files were gone. Without her, there was no case. There was only a black man in handcuffs and a gas can somebody else had set down next to his truck. She was still at the table when her phone rang. Martha, the neighbor. Otis was awake. She drove to the hospital. He had been moved out of the ICU that morning. He looked smaller in the bed than he had at his own kitchen table, but the eyes were the same, clear and slightly impatient, as though consciousness were a meeting he had shown up late to. "The storage unit," he said. "Gone. Everything in it." He was quiet a moment. "Then it's a good thing the photographs aren't in the storage unit." She looked at him. "I told you I'm careful about the parts that matter. 30 years in fire investigation, you learn not to keep your evidence in one building. He shifted against the pillow. Fireproof box at the house. Service medals, my wife's papers, the Marlowe Street photographs. I put them in there the week I retired because I never believed that case was finished. Rochelle sat back. Can you testify? Give me a week, he said. I'll testify. She did not learn about the phone until 2 days later. Ivy had been staying with Carol, her father's sister, a steady woman who had stepped in without being asked and asked for nothing in return. Carol had brought a box of Lorenzo's things over from the apartment so Ivy would have familiar objects around her, and Ivy had been going through it, looking for one specific photograph of her mother, the one from the beach. She did not find it. What she found was a phone she did not recognize, an old one, the kind that would not talk to anything anymore without its own charger. The charger was in the same box, coiled and rubber-banded the way her father kept everything. She plugged it in out of curiosity. The phone had belonged to her mother. There was one audio file in the recordings folder dated the night of the fire. Ivy almost did not open it. She sat on the edge of the bed in her aunt's guest room a long time, with the phone in both hands, understanding in the way children understand things fully before they have words for them, that whatever was in that file was going to change something. She pressed play. Her mother's voice filled the small room. It was not a call. It was not an emergency line. It was Danica, quiet and deliberate, speaking into her own phone. She said she did not know if she was going to find another way out. She said she had told Lorenzo to take the woman on the landing first because that was the thing that made sense, and she would do it again. Then she stopped. And when she spoke again, her voice had changed, gone softer, aimed at one specific person. Baby girl. If you're hearing this, it means Daddy told you the truth someday, and you're going to be angry. Don't be. Your father did what I told him to do because that's the kind of man he is, the kind who listens when it matters. Don't you ever let him carry this like it was his, and don't you carry it either. A breath. I love you both. That's the whole of it. Ivy set the phone down on the bed. She did not cry right away. She sat with her mother's voice settling into the room around her, and after a while she understood that she had been angry at the wrong thing for a very long time. Not at Rochelle. Rochelle had been unconscious on a hallway floor, not at her father. Her father had done exactly what her mother asked him to do, at the locked door, at the people who locked it, at the small, deliberate cruelty of a padlock on a fire exit. She picked up her own phone and called Rochelle. The hearing was on a Wednesday. Rochelle took the stand and gave her testimony in the unhurried language of somebody who had spent a decade learning that facts persuade best when nobody decorates them. She laid out Lorenzo's medical record in sequence: the initial injury, the extent of the damage to the shoulder, the weight-bearing capacity of that arm on the night of the storage unit fire documented in her own hand 2 days before it. She testified that the physical evidence was inconsistent with Lorenzo carrying a full 5-gallon can from any point in that lot. She referenced the attending notes, the imaging, the physical therapy consultation that had been ordered and never filled because he had lost his insurance. She did not look at Sloan's legal team once. Otis testified from a wheelchair 8 days out of the ICU. He presented the photographs from the fireproof box, the padlock housing still bolted to the Marlowe Street fire exit, the chain, the internal email from the Sloan Group's property management division authorizing the lock. He presented his original investigation report signed and dated, which had never been formally dismissed, only deprioritized once the settlements removed his complainants. Lorenzo spoke for himself. He had not planned to. His lawyer had advised against it. He stood anyway and said that he had gone into that storage unit for the same reason he had gone up a staircase 5 years ago, and that a man who had to set a fire to bury a padlock had already told everyone what the padlock meant. Ivy sat in the gallery with Carol and did not look away. Danny Walsh arrived 20 minutes into the proceedings and asked to speak. He said he had watched Lorenzo go into a burning building to pull an old man out with a torn shoulder and no reason except that it needed doing. He said he had gone home after that and decided he was finished being afraid of a man like Gavin Sloan. He submitted backup copies of Lorenzo's photographs. Lorenzo had emailed them to him 2 weeks before the accident as a record of the violations he intended to report. The email was time-stamped. The photographs were geotagged. The wiring in them matched the wiring in the Marlowe Street incident report. The charges against Lorenzo were dropped before the end of the week. The investigation that followed moved quickly once it had traction. The evidence was never complicated. It had only been buried. Gavin Sloan was arrested on charges of obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, criminal fraud, and the falsification of safety certifications, and conspiracy to commit defamation. His legal team made noise. The noise did not help him. The hospital board reviewed Rochelle's suspension. The finding was that her actions had served the interests of patient welfare and public safety, and that the complaint against her had been filed under false pretenses. Her license was restored. The Sloan Group, under pressure from the city and from the Marlowe Street families, who had never stopped paying attention, agreed to establish a compensation fund. It would not undo anything. It was not meant to. It was the closest thing to accountability the law had on offer, and it would have to be enough. Ivy found Rochelle outside the courthouse on the last day. She came alone and stood on the steps with her hands in her pockets and the particular composure of a kid who has rehearsed something and then decided to say something else. She held out a photograph, small, printed on ordinary paper, the edges slightly bent. Danica Bishop, mid-laugh, turning toward a camera she had not known was pointed at her. "She picked you," Ivy said. "I was mad about that for a long time, but she picked you, and that was hers to pick." She looked at the picture a second longer before letting go of it. "I think she'd be upset if I turned her choice into something to be angry about." Rochelle held the photograph in both hands and said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. The Marlowe Street Memorial was dedicated on a Saturday in September. The city had converted the old fire exit, the door with the padlock, the door that had cost 3 people their lives, into the entrance of a small garden. The names of the dead were engraved on the wall beside it. Below them, in a separate column, the names of the civilians who had assisted in the evacuation. Lorenzo Bishop's name was there, in writing, in stone. For the first time. He stood in front of it a long while. Rochelle stood behind him, far enough back to give the moment its proper shape. This was his and Ivy's. She had not earned a place in it by proximity. She had been unconscious for the worst of it carried through it by the man now reading his own name off a wall. Ivy stood beside her father with her hand in Hittite. After a while, without turning around, she put her other hand out behind her. Rochelle took it. Ivy pulled her forward, and the 3 of them stood together in front of Danica's name, while the September light came down through the trees and a city went about its business around them. Lorenzo spoke to her quietly later when Ivy had wandered ahead into the garden. "I kept my distance from you because every time I looked at you I saw that night." He was not looking at her. He was watching Ivy crouch to read a plaque near the base of the wall. "I thought you were the proof of what I got wrong." "I know. I was wrong about that. I know that too." He looked at her then. "You're the proof that what Danica did mattered, that it wasn't spent for nothing." He was quiet a moment. "I don't know how to hold that yet. I'm working on it." "You don't have to have it figured out," Rochelle said. "Just let me stand here while you do." He nodded. That was enough for now. That was enough. Months later, on an unremarkable Tuesday evening, Rochelle sat at Lorenzo's kitchen table while something cooked on the stove, and Ivy narrated in considerable detail the social dynamics of her 7th grade class. Danica's photograph was still on the wall above the refrigerator, laughing mid-turn permanent. Ivy got up to set the table and put down 3 plates without being asked. She set Rochelle's on the left because she had learned that was where she liked it. The apartment was not quiet the way it used to be. It was loud with ordinary life. A spoon against a pot, a chair scraping, Ivy's commentary continuing whether or not anybody answered. Lorenzo looked across the kitchen at Rochelle. She had walked out of a fire 5 years ago in someone else's arms and spent half a decade trying to close the distance between the woman she had been that night and the woman she was now. Sitting at this table, she understood that the distance had not closed the day she found the man who carried her. It had closed in the month since, in the unannounced incremental way healing actually happens. Not all at once. Not with one moment of resolution. In accumulated evenings and shared meals and the slow return of things grief had borrowed. Lorenzo had saved her life once. She had not saved his, but she had stayed. Some nights that turned out to be the same thing. Ivy set a fork down in front of her. "Stop looking at each other," she said, with the authority of a girl who had decided to find it funny rather than unbearable. "The food's ready." She was not wrong. It was. Sometimes the person who pulls you out of the fire is still trapped in one of their own and has been for years alone without anyone knowing. This story is a reminder that saying thank you matters, that showing up matters, and that healing rarely looks the way we expect it to. If this one stayed with you, subscribe. There are more like it waiting, and if you know somebody who's been carrying something heavy for too long, send it to them. Sometimes that's all it takes.